Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. New Zealand has been experiencing some wild weather this week. Red wind warnings were issued for much of Canterbury, Marlborough, Wellington and southern Wairarapa as at yesterday afternoon. Flights and ferries were cancelled and tens of thousands of households have been without power. Meanwhile, strong winds have been hampering firefighting efforts in several parts of the country. So, is this usual for this time of year? And how long will we have to wait for some sunny days ahead? Today on The Front Page, NIWA Principal Scientist Chris Brandolino is with us to take us through what's causing this stormy weather and whether there is, in fact, light at the end of the tunnel. First off, Chris, tell us why this is happening. What's causing these high winds across the country?
Two words: pressure gradient. So you may be wondering, what the heck is that? Basically, it describes the change of air pressure over distance. So think of it this way: replace the term pressure gradient with elevation change. Imagine if you're a cyclist, you're at the top of a hill, right? And you're going to go down the hill. You're going to go a lot faster if the hill is steep, right? Going from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill. You'll go maybe not as fast if that hill is more gentle or not as steep. If that elevation change isn't as dramatic. Think of high pressure in the atmosphere like the top of the hill. High pressure brings nice weather. And for those listening or watching from the Upper North Island, Auckland and Hamilton and up toward Northland, we had some beautiful weather on Sunday, going back to the weekend. Even better weather on Monday, not so bad on Tuesday. That was because of high pressure. Now, that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, low pressure is like a hole in the atmosphere, and Mother Nature is trying to fill that hole with the fluid called air. And so when you have high pressure, top of the hill, low pressure, kind of bottom of the hill, or a hole, a valley, if they're quite distinct in terms of one being high, one being quite low or deep, then your elevation change or your pressure gradient can be quite dramatic. And that is what causes wind, is pressure gradient, the change in air pressure over distance. If you think of it like a mountain and a hill, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When we hear about wind warnings of, 130, 150, 200 kilometres an hour, what does that actually look like in real terms?
I think you just go on media right now, social media, and just see the impact. When you see wind gusts of, 170, 180, 200K, you're getting to category 2, category 3 tropical cyclone intensity. I mean, this is not a tropical cyclone, but it's the intensity. You're trying to wrap your head around this. And that is what can cause, these bursts of wind, which are wind gusts, 2-3 second bursts of wind. That is what generally causes a lot of the damage. And we've seen that play out. We've seen wind gusts. I was just looking, Invercargill had a wind gust, I think, of 100. I'm looking off screen here, 137K, and over toward Gore, a wind gust of 124K, I believe. And at Wellington at the airport, 126. And Cow in Wellington, Cow, the mountain there, 155 kilometers per hour. So that type of wind gust, if you can't wrap your head around it, you just go to social media and you see like the pine trees leaning down on like a whole row of pine trees over toward Hamner Forest, leaning down on power lines, or roofs being lifted, obviously the trampolines and, any deck furniture, things like that. That'll be, that could be Ks down the road or, half K, hundreds of meters anyway. Yeah.
Is this usual for this time of year?
Not to this degree. I mean, this is what the red warning, the red warning kind of, reflects the unusual nature. We don't see those every day. That's for sure. Look, spring is always a changeable season, and with that change, that variety, I like to call spring the teenager of season because a lot of mood swings, ups and downs, and with that moodiness comes wind. So, it's not unusual to have windy periods in spring. That's part of spring. But this is next level, and what's driving that is kind of nerdy. We've had a lot of low pressure, that hole in the atmosphere I talked about, right? We had over the Southern Ocean. So the Southern Ocean is that big body of water separating New Zealand and Antarctica, down to the ice. And we've had low pressure just favoring and continuously moving through the Southern Ocean, brushing against the South Island at times. And that has been a big reason for our wind, our strong westerly wind. Why is that low pressure in the Southern Ocean? Why is it there a lot? Well, believe it or not, we can trace that back to Antarctica, of all places. So at the very top of the atmosphere, like way at the very top over the South Pole, back in September, the temperatures got really warm really fast, at least for that part of the atmosphere. And when that happened, kind of jump into the chase, if you will, what that did is that kind of displaced all that low pressure that typically favors the Antarctic region, what we call the polar vortex. It basically allowed for that low pressure to be displaced into the Southern Ocean. And because of that, we now have these strong westerly winds, big hole in the atmosphere, if you will, over the Southern Ocean, kind of a decent-sized mountain near northern New Zealand. And those two features are creating that pressure gradient, that change in pressure, or as we said before, that change in elevation. And this is why we've seen these persistent episodes of high wind. We saw some earlier in the week. We're seeing them now. And guess what? We're probably going to see it again next week on Labor Day. So just a heads up for those getting a head start on the unofficial start to the, summer season. Be mindful that Monday of next week, things are still, crystallizing. But there will be another low coming from the west and north. And that will probably bring with it another round of active weather. Probably not to the degree we're seeing today, but still could be quite impactful because it's a big travel day and people will be, enjoying the public holiday. So that is something we could see again. And we could see some really cold temperatures, unusually cold temperatures behind that on Tuesday, which could impact farmers and livestock because we're now into the growing season. So because of these big swings, like right now in Kaikoura, it got to more than 30 degrees today. 30 degrees. But
wow.
But yeah, and then we're talking about much cooler temperatures tomorrow. Then we're talking about temperatures going up on Sunday and Monday, Labor Day, then going back down on Tuesday. Those big temperature changes, they are congruent with wind. Whenever you have these big temperature changes, oftentimes a reflection of those temperature changes up and down, that roller coaster, is strong wind. So what we're seeing play out, high wind, active weather, big temperature changes, they're all kind of connected.
Have we any idea when things should stabilize?
It's a great question. Look, if you would have asked me that, if we were talking like a month ago and you asked me that question, I would have said with a fair bit of confidence, it'll come right middle, second half of October. Well, guess what? We're in the second half of October and we're still talking about it. What I talked about over Antarctica, that rapid warming at the very tippy top of the atmosphere, that's called a sudden stratospheric warming event. We just call it SSW. So use an SSW. Drop that in your dinner time conversation. You'll raise some eyebrows. That SSW, that tends to have lingering effects several weeks after. So it looks like this sort of pattern where we have active weather, strong westerlies, things like that, up and down with temperature, that's probably going to continue through at least the rest of October. So we got another week or so. And if you look at the long-range guidance, it actually may go into the first 10 days of November. So we may have to wait until the middle, second week, third week of November. Once that happens, it will happen eventually. It's a matter of being delayed, but not denied. But when it does happen, the expectation is we'll have settled weather kick in over the country, high pressure, and we should see a change in the rainfall patterns. So for the past couple months, since the beginning of spring, it's the west of the South Island that's been getting hammered with a lot of rain, mountain snow, high wind. That's probably good. And we have dry weather for the eastern part of the islands, especially up toward Hawke's Bay, where they have some pretty dry conditions. Once we see that pattern shift, our winds are going to shift. And when our winds shift, so does the rainfall pattern. So as we work our way into the second half of November and into summer proper, December, January, and February, odds are we should see the areas that have been wet, western and lower South Island, they should become drier. And areas that have been dry, Hawke's Bay, eastern Northland, their odds for rainfall should start going up. But that may take another 2, 3, 4 weeks to happen.
power's gone out, the big pine tree, one of them's just gone over. There is flying everywhere. There's plastic milk things flying from God knows where. Stuff is just coming from everywhere. That the fences are also down. Those deer are going to disappear up that river. A roof. Taylor! We just lost part of the roof! Got the pine tree shelter belt of the neighbours, and the trees are just going over like dominoes. Dug, dug, dug. And we're only at 106k, so if we get up to 150, everything's going to... Oh my god. Turn the power off! Half our roof's gone. That's part of it there, and then the other part of it is way over the other side of the road.
Now, we all know that climate change has a huge impact on weather patterns. I mean, surely by now everybody must know this. Is that what's at play here? Are we still within what's called normal weather patterns?
Look, climate change doesn't cause extreme weather. Just like fertilizer doesn't make grass grow. It makes it grow better, makes it grow faster and overcome things. What climate change does, it makes extreme weather, A, more extreme, B, makes it more likely to happen, and C, makes it more frequent. So climate change in itself isn't the culprit for extreme weather. Extreme weather has always happened, as we know, but it makes the extremes higher or more extreme, and the frequency and the likelihood of them grow with climate change. So to your, if people are wondering, this weather event that we're seeing now, is that because of climate change? Look, I'm not a climate change expert. My guess is that it's not because of climate change, but there may be some footprints of climate change, maybe because of warmer than usual oceans around New Zealand, the Tasman Sea. If you have a warmer ocean, warmer than usual, that puts more water vapor, more energy in the air. And that sort of energy can help fuel a storm. But it's a complex process. No one event is caused by climate change, but as I say, it makes these events more frequent, more likely, and more intense.
I mean, it's easy to think about the damage in sensational terms. You know, you've got trees falling on cars, roofs being lifted off buildings, etc. But there's also things like planes being grounded, power outages. I mean, Nelson Hospital suffered a 45-minute power outage yesterday, and 45 minutes might not seem like a lot, but when you've got people hooked up to machines breathing for them, then it's really serious. What are some of the less, I suppose, sensational but still very costly or dangerous risks of severe weather?
Well, I think people's mental well-being is one of them. Just think about for those who experienced the severe weather events back in early 2023 when we had the Auckland anniversary flooding, and then we had Cyclone Gabrielle, and then there were other flooding events after that, and you start to get a bit jumpy. I mean, I did, and this is my living. And every time there'd be a heavy downpour, it kind of triggers you a little bit, So I think people's mental health is one facet of how people can be affected adversely by high impact weather events. Obviously, your insurance claims, when you have to, if your house gets destroyed or your roof gets torn off or you have flooding to deal with, you're going to have to put a claim in. And, odds are your insurance premiums are going to go up, even, if the claim is sorted and, but it's dealing with all those those day-to-day, your day-to-day life. I can only imagine, if my roof is blown off, it's one thing you got to make dinner and go about doing your business day to day. But if you have no roof, it just throws a complete spanner in the works. And that goes back to the mental health component, I suppose.
Yeah, so just that weather fatigue, hey?
Yeah, exactly. Great term, fatigue, exactly. So, I mean, it's things like that. It's things like maybe, if it could be if trucks are driving and they're pushed over on the roadway, maybe that's a delivery that doesn't get somewhere. So people's businesses, things have to shut down. So maybe there's an impact to the economy. So there's a lot of sort of, I guess, long-reaching things that we could probably have a pretty long conversation about that are hard to maybe quantify without. That's probably a kind of a research or a science question. It's like, how do you quantify the impacts of a significant weather event or a multitude of significant weather events that are in succession? How beside the obvious of people's injury and property damage, and I imagine that would be long-reaching, and that would be kind of, from a science perspective, kind of fascinating in some ways, I would think.
We're talking to you on Thursday afternoon, of course, while the warnings are still in place, but already there's been a tragic death of a man in Wellington who was struck by a falling branch, and there could be more damage and injuries by the time this episode is published. But it's a stark reminder, I think, of the power of these systems. Do we take these things seriously enough?
Yeah, it's kind of a tough one because, the red warnings are really good because what's built into a red warning is like, oh, this is different. I need to behave differently. I need to really think about my decisions if I'm in that red warning area. But when you go to other warnings potentially, there is an element of like, well, how does this event differ from another event that maybe isn't quite so severe? And I know Met Service, we're working with Met Service. Obviously, Met Service is becoming part of the Earth Sciences New Zealand Fauna, where, GNS and NIWA, they were separate. Now we're one. Met Service coming into the fold, which is great because we need this as a country in order to deal with what Mother Nature throws our way. So this is a really good thing. And one of the things that I know Met Service is doing and they're keen on progressing is kind of changing the warning system and improving the warning system. So hopefully those changes will address some of the things that what your question is about. But I think at the heart of it, in any warning system, this could be in Aussie, this could be in America, this could be in the UK, is you hear about a warning and then, oh yeah, the weather's bad, but maybe you didn't have a big impact. Maybe your house didn't get, damaged, or maybe your property wasn't damaged by falling trees. And so you hear there's another warning coming and, you're going to go by memory. Well, heck, the last time there was a warning, nothing really happened to me. So I don't really need to take any action. Or, oh yeah, the weather forecasters, they get it wrong. They're going to say this and it doesn't really happen. And so there's a bit of that. That's a big social science question, actually. So this is where social scientists play a key role into the development of, say, weather warnings and how to communicate them and how to basically frame them in a lot of ways. So there is an element of, and hopefully I'm answering your question. I realize I'm talking a lot, but maybe not giving you a useful answer because it's a hard one to articulate. And it's not my specialty in terms of social science, obviously. But I think, just from being in the business for so long, people kind of like, she'll be right attitude. Well, maybe she won't be, this is where I think there can be some improvements from a science and weather provider perspective. But I also think there can be some improvements with people really taking, some education where people do take the warnings more seriously because they often go by what happened before. And just because something happened before and didn't result in a bad impact for you, your roof being torn off, your house being flooded or damaged, it doesn't guarantee that'll happen again. Unfortunately, weather forecasts, they can only be so precise. So when a weather warning is issued, they're usually issued for a large area like Canterbury. Canterbury is a huge area, but the impacts can be quite variable in Canterbury, unless it's something historic like Gabrielle, where there was really widespread damage. But even then, there were, there were landslips in one places, but not in the other. Some rivers had really, really bad flooding, some didn't. So part of it too is that warnings are issued for broad areas, but there can be variable impacts within that warning area. Some could have really, really high impacts. In some areas, the impacts could be quite pedestrian, if at all.
I don't think that's meant to be there. This is hectic. I'm gonna get the out of here. They ain't gonna be powered for a while, guys. Whoa! Ooh, look, a hovering power line. I'm getting out of here.
I've heard a lot of people wondering, where is spring? And I've heard a lot of people talk about whether the seasons are changing. So at what point do you think we scrap the current season calendar altogether and shift everything by a month and call it a day?
No, I can't do that. Look, seasons are a human construct, right? The seasons are changing in a way. And we had a scientist who since passed on, but Dr. Brett Mullen, I remember when I first came to, at the time, NIWA, he did a bit of, I guess a bit of an investigation on have the seasons changed? And what he did is he looked at when the first frost occurred and for select locations around the country. And it turned out, and I'm going off memory here, hopefully I don't butcher his findings, that basically frosts were happening later in autumn. So the first frost, was happening later, deeper into the season, and the last frost was happening in springtime, was happening earlier. So what happens is that the shoulder seasons are getting warmer. The shoulder seasons being autumn and spring, right? So what we're seeing is that the warmth is lingering longer. So when summer ends, we enter autumn, and that warmth is lingering a bit longer and longer, and it takes longer for that first frost to occur. Also, in springtime, we're warming up a bit sooner. So the last frost happens a bit earlier. So using that as a metric, the seasons are evolving. But look, people are probably like, where is spring? This is spring, man. This is spring. Now, admittedly, this is spring kind of next level with the high wind, and we've seen these damaging wind events. We've seen a lot of rain.
This is spring hitting puberty.
Yeah. Well said, yeah. But even if this spring weren't as volatile or as active, and it was maybe a notch lower, this would be pretty typical. Acknowledging today and Tuesday and other days have not been typical. Just that if they were brought down a bit, that's normal. Spring has ups and downs. It is the teenager of the seasons. Very moody.
Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Jane Yee and Richard Martin, who is also our editor. I'm Chelsea Daniels. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in on Monday for another look behind the headlines.